Hello YouTube. Oblivion is full of interesting characters, both in the game and in the lore of the game, and I've covered many of them in the past on this channel, from the High Chancellor of the Elder Council, Ocato, to the mean and evil Valen Dreth. And in this longer lore collection I put all the lore on these people together in this long form lore video for you to enjoy with timestamps in case you want to skip a certain character or skip this intro for example. So, with that being said, there will be significant spoilers for the main quest of the game and several side quests in this video. And don't see this as a definitive list of all interesting characters in Oblivion, there are many more, and perhaps they will appear in a part 2 of this collection someday. But now, without any further ado, let's roll the intro and talk about the first character, the legendary arena champion himself, the Grey Prince. So, the Grey Prince, lesser known by his actual name Agroknecht, is the arena champion that we find in the Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion and the final boss of the arena questline before we as the players can become the Grand Champion of the arena. He is one of the most well-known and popular people all around Cyrodiil, with hordes of supporters which comes to the Imperial city from all over the Empire to see him fight, as many consider him to be the greatest fighter on Tamriel at around the time of the Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion. And with good reason, as he's been the undisputed champion of the arena for more than 10 years when we meet him, defeating any challenger, great and small, who'd come to face him, and defeating many monsters and creatures in exhibition battles for glory in the arena. But not only his impressive fighting contributed to his fame, because he is, as far as we know, the only half-orc around Cyrodiil, and unlike the rest of his green-skinned kin, has a grey skin. He's never made a secret of the fact that he's an half-orc, and when he became the champion of the arena, it led him to the title of Grey Prince. A title that he himself finds to be a bit silly, but he remarks that the people of Cyrodiil need heroes and that he's more than happy to oblige and fulfill that role for them. When he's asked about his origins, he is open to people about his history, and he tells you how he's the son of an Imperial noble lord who had an affair with his mother, an orc. He tells you that when the Lord's wife found out, she tried killing him and his mother, causing his mother to flee with him. The actions of the Lord's wife denied him any noble titles, but in the arena he strove to be noble in his own right, meaning noble in his deeds, as he respected opponents and he was friendly towards the people that he met and was happy to help new arena participants get on their feet in the system and give them advice. But despite all his fame and glory earned in the arena, he kept being curious about his origins and about his father, as his mother refused to elaborate any further beyond the story she told him about having to flee when the Lord's wife found out. Even when her son became the Grey Prince and one of Cyrodiil's most famous individuals, she wouldn't tell him more. It was only when she passed away, shortly before we can meet Agroknecht in the Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion, that she told him to go and look for proof of his father, giving him a key which would unlock the secrets to his birth at a castle called Crownhaven near Anvil. Being the Grand Champion of the arena, Agroknecht had no time to leave the city himself, so when we meet him as the player, he asks us to travel to Crownhaven and bring him back proof of his birth. If we decide to do it and travel to Crownhaven, we find that the castle is completely in ruins and totally abandoned, save for some rats and other foul creatures prowling around the undercroft of the castle. When we search the ruins, we eventually find a locked door which can be opened using the key that Agroknecht gave to us. Behind it we find a large luxurious room with a feral and starving vampire within who's gone mad with hunger and a lack of blood to feed on. We're forced to kill the vampire, but we can find several written documents by the vampire from before he turned feral, and we can find out that the vampire had been the Lord Lythandas, former lord of the area and father of the Grey Prince, or so the Grey Prince claims. We can read in his journal that he had actually been a nobleman, but had become infected with vampirism eventually. He tried to cope with it as best as possible and lead a normal life, just like Count Janus Hassildor of Skiengrad, who is also a vampire, and does the similar thing with trying to lead a normal life. I've also made a video on him, so watch that if you're interested in it, it's in the description of this video. The journal of Lord Lythandas describes the Lord falling madly in love with his orcish servant, Lythandas, the Grey Prince's mother. Nobody around him, including her, knew of his vampiric affliction, and he kept it a secret from everyone, including her, even as they came together and she returned his love eventually. He wanted to tell her of his affliction, but could never muster up the courage, and then something nearly impossible happened. She got pregnant with a child of his. Vampire's fertility is said to be quite low, and the chance of an orc and a human making a successful offspring is also really low, so the chances of this were near impossible, but yet it happened. And the Lord Leviticus knew that he had no choice but to tell her of his affliction now that there was a chance that their offspring would have strange deficiencies, and it'd be better that she knew beforehand, so he told her. But unfortunately for him, Lythandas felt betrayed when he told her, and scared after he told her that he was a vampire. She ran from him and called him a monster and refused to come out of her room for the rest of the day, locking herself in. That night, however, as Lord Leviticus slept, she locked him in his room, in his private underground chamber, so he would never be able to escape, and then she fled from the castle after telling everyone of his affliction. The people of the area fled and avoided the castle, allowing it to fall to ruin. And Lord Leviticus slowly went mad underground out of vampiric hunger, and nobody ever saw him again, until he was slain by the hero of Kvarch as you, the player, come and retrieve his journal. We can bring the journal to Agronek, the Grey Prince, and reveal his origins to him, but if you do, Agronek will wail in despair with the knowledge that he is a half-vampire, and he will fall into a deep depression, seeing himself as a wretched spawn of evil. When the time then comes to face him in the arena, to battle to become the Grand Champion, he will not put up a fight. He will lay down his arms and ask you to slay him, as he cannot live like this, knowing that he's something filthy and evil, begging you to kill him in the arena in front of his adoring fans. It's quite the tragic story with a bitter end for one so glorious as the Grey Prince, and it shows how much people hate vampires in the Elder Scrolls universe, and how being one, or at least part of one, is associated with absolute filthy evil, even if there is nuance to that with people like Count Hassildor, Serana, and of course Lord Ludovicus before he went mad, demonstrating that it is possible to be a peaceful vampire who lives not to do others harm. It's a shame and a real sad ending to his story. But before ending the video, allow me to mention something real quick, because I once made a video on genetics and procreation in the Elder Scrolls universe. The narration of those two videos is not as good as this one, but watch it if you want. It's also in the description. Anyway, those videos explain how when people in the Elder Scrolls universe have children, it will always have the race of the mother, or at least a really high percentage of chance that it will have the race of the mother. Half-breeds are very, very rare, but the story of the Grey Prince shows that how if one parent is a vampire and the other isn't, that it will actually influence the child and make them half-vampire in the Grey Prince case, or at least give them vampiric traits affecting their appearance, even if the mother is no vampire. Which is curious, as usually the child inherits the racial abilities and qualities fully from the mother, so that's quite interesting, in my opinion. And that was about all I can say about the Grey Prince. Now, next up, let's talk about a mystery, specifically the mystery connected to this man, Rythe Lythandas, the famous painter of Chainedol. His story and his personal quests are tied to a pretty big mystery, so let's talk about him and the mystery of the Painted Worlds. Alright, so recently I was replaying Oblivion and I replayed the quest A Brush of Death, in which you enter the Painted World, a world inside a painting in which its painter got trapped with aggressive painted trolls that prevent him from escaping. I never really bothered thinking too critically about this quest, that I just assumed that it was something that the designers thought would be fun and then just never reference again and pretend it never happened. But strangely enough, that's not the case. In fact, this quest with the Painted World got references in almost every Elder Scrolls game since Oblivion. It's referenced in Skyrim, Elder Scrolls Online, and even in the Elder Scrolls Legends, and even in the official Elder Scrolls novel Lord of Souls. That's 3 more games and 4 more mentions than Fargoth got outside of Morrowind, and people still talk about him, so I think it's definitely worth talking about this. You see, in Oblivion you enter the painting because the wife of the painter got concerned when her husband suddenly disappeared from his atelier. He was just nowhere to be found, with only his painting supplies and unfinished paintings left in the room. The painter, Rythe Lythandas, is quite a celebrity around Cyrodiil. He is one of the Empire's most renowned painters, famous for his amazing, almost lifelike paintings of Cyrodiil's forests. So him going missing is quite a big deal. You then investigate his atelier and soon you discover that touching the painting on the easel transports you into the Painted World, a small realm filled with painted trees, hills, skies. Basically, you are in the painting, and it's actually quite a pretty little piece of Oblivion to walk around in my opinion at least. Well, In the painted world you immediately find Rythe, who tells you that he's stuck inside the painting. He then reveals that he is not actually a real painter, but rather that he got his hands on a magical artifact that was passed down from his father to him called True Paint. A paintbrush, he says, that has been gifted to his father by the goddess Dibella after his father, who was an avid painter, lost his arms while fighting in a war. The paintbrush, which is allegedly made out of Dibella's own hairs, has the property of creating a world out of canvas, which can be entered by mortals, and inside this world he who holds the paintbrush can basically imagine anything they want, and it will appear life-size in the painted world, and it will also appear on the canvas in the real world. That way Rythe was able to make all these amazing lifelike paintings. So this paintbrush was allegedly a gift from Dibella to his father, because his father was such a passionate painter, but without his arms, which he lost in the war, he wasn't able to paint, so Dibella gave him a brush that could do it for him instead. Alright, that's what he tells us at least. So for his entire career, all that Rythe had to do was just enter the canvas with True Paint, imagine scenery, and then paint a portal for himself to get back into the real world and leave the painting. And then once done with the painting, he just closes the entrance into the painted world somehow, how exactly isn't described, and you get this perfect lifelike painting of anything that you could imagine while you were in there. Now, in the quest, it turns out that while he was working inside the painted world, a thief who had presumably hidden himself in his atelier followed him into the painting, stole the brush of True Paint, and then fled further into the painted world as he painted trolls to stop Rythe from chasing him as he ran, hoping that he could get far away enough from Rythe not to be able to catch him, and then paint a portal for himself to get out of the painting again. Well, unfortunately, his own trolls turned on him and then killed him on the edge of the painted world, where you can literally see the blank canvas as he fell dead, murdered by the trolls that he himself painted. This left Rythe, who is not a fighter, stuck in the painted world, as he could not retrieve True Paint from the thief's body due to the trolls being in his way. You, as the player, can then defeat the trolls. You return the brush to Rythe, and he paints the two of you out of that world by painting a portal out of the painted world to back to the real world. You then get a minor reward and quest done. But the questions begin here, because what exactly is going on here? First of all, do the paintings actually turn into paintings when he finishes them off and then closes off access to the painted world? Or does True Paint just casually create these small realms and then he sells these small realms, which are closed off, as paintings? So essentially selling small closed off portals to these painted worlds, where you can only look inside them instead of being able to travel into them because he closed off access. Or do they turn into paintings in the same way how you can work on an image on your PC, so it's modifiable, and then print it using a printer, and then it's no longer modifiable because it's an actual image? Like, how does this work? And second question, what exactly are these painted worlds that you can enter? It seems highly unlikely that they are pocket realms of Oblivion, as Dibella, the alleged creator of the brush, is an Adric goddess and not a Daedric lord, and Adric realms are not really something that we see all that often, since their nature is so different to that of Daedric realms. I've seen people online speculate that it's possible that these painted worlds are realms created inside what is Dibella's planet or realm, as the Adra allegedly have realms of their own circling Nirn-like planets in the mortal plane, which we don't really visit in any of the games. But even that is just completely up for debate, because we don't really know what the exact nature of these realms are and whether something like these pocket realms would be possible inside one of them. So yeah, what exactly these painted worlds are is a complete mystery. But the mystery gets even deeper, because some people have claimed that the painted world is simply a very complicated illusion spell, but you see, it's not that. Because the trolls, when you kill them, are able to fill a soul gem, meaning that True Paint can somehow create souls, a brush which can create souls. But even if you think that that's just a game mechanic, it gets even better, because the trolls drop this rare ingredient that you can only obtain inside the painted world called painted troll fat, which has unique alchemical properties as opposed to normal troll fat, and you can take that outside of the painting without it disappearing, so things created inside the painted world can transfer outside of it into the Mundus, so that's the place Tamriel is in, the realm. And it's most definitely not a game mechanic, as in Skyrim, so the game after Oblivion, the Alchemist of Riften has dialogue saying that he has to contact Rythe Lythandas, you know, the painter that we just rescued in Oblivion. I mean, he's a Dark Elf, so it's logical that he's still alive by the time of Skyrim, considering their lifespans. but he has to contact him to get some painted troll fat, as it's a very rare and expensive ingredient that only Rythe sells and exports by the time of Skyrim. So even within the universe, taking things out of the painting is actually canon. Like, where does this stop? If painted trolls have a soul and they could theoretically leave the painting through a painted portal just like their fat, does that mean that the one holding the brush could create intelligent beings as well? Say if you painted, or rather imagined, an Imperial soldier inside of the painted realm. Like, this man, Rythe, just casually uses his artifact to create paintings, but he might be holding the power of a literal god, if that works. But there's one final piece of the puzzle which we still haven't talked about and which hasn't been fitted into this whole story yet, specifically Rythe lying to us, or at least his father lying to Rythe about how they got the brush of true paint. Like I said, his father told Rythe that he got the brush from Dibella when he lost his arms in the war, so he would be able to continue to express himself in art. But if that's true, which is possible, I mean it's possible because all of Elder Scrolls is basically an unreliable narrator, then the final piece of the puzzle would be a massive coincidence. You see, in the Elder Scrolls Online we can find the journal of one Bravam Lythandas, a far ancestor of Rythe and his father, or maybe not even that far, since Dark Elves have a quite long lifespan. Thinking about it, it might even just be his grandfather, but we don't really know their family tree, like, this doesn't go that deep. This journal of Bravam basically reveals that he was a Dunmer sorcerer who psychologically tormented some people that he kidnapped to try and research the effect of illusions on the mortal mind. He used powerful illusion spells and enchantments to have some people in his basement believe that they actually lived in an elaborate palace, and that they were in fact nobles and not just kidnapped by him. This started working after some experimentation, but after a few weeks his text subjects just started completely losing their minds, with one of them continually praying to Dibella for relief. It's actually a really fucked up experiment. I can recommend reading the entire journal to find out how bad this dude was. Like, he convinced one of the test subjects that he would die if he took off the necklace which kept the illusion alive, so it's pretty nasty. Anyway, one day Bravam Lythandas entered his basement only to find that everything in it, his test subjects and all the furniture, was just gone, and every wall of the room was now painted, depicting large murals of the insides of an elaborate palace, with all that was left in the room being just a small paintbrush and some paint supplies, with that paintbrush obviously being true paint. This implies that someone or something intervened, gave the kidnapped test subjects true paint which allowed them to escape into a painted world depicting a palace in which they now truly wanted to live, but now away from the psychological torment of their captor. But this story implies that the brush has been in the possession of the Lythandas family ever since, for the subsequent 1000 years to Skyrim, handed down from parent to child every generation. This allowed the Lythandas family to become basically a lineage of famous painters, keeping the true powers of true paint a secret. Of course, this secret sometimes leaked out and people looked for the elusive brush over the ages, as we can witness in the Elder Scrolls Online, but nobody ever connected them to the Lythandas family, and they usually died before finding them. So what exactly is this brush of true paint? Well, the most straightforward explanation is that we can just trust the dialogue that is given to us, and that it's just an artifact of Dibella, originally given by Dibella as an act of mercy to the captives of Bravam Lythandas, which allowed them to create a small pocket realm to live in away from their captor. This strengthens the theory that the Divines, or the Aedra, are still quite powerful at manipulating the Mundus, and at least have their own realms like the Daedra, as it would be likely that the painted worlds are just pocket realms of Dibella's realm, if it's truly an artifact of Dibella. Which acolytes of Dibella believe, by the way, that it's an artifact of Dibella, that is. But Elder Scrolls is full of unreliable narrators, and this whole ordeal kinda got me thinking. Save for some very specific incidents, the Divines don't really tend to interfere with the Mundus as much as the Daedric princes do, for example, so it's also very possible that this artifact, True Paint, is not a Dibellan artifact at all, but it's rather assumed by the ancestor of Rythe, Bravam Lythandas, that Dibella gave it to his captives because one of the captives was just praying to Dibella all the time, but we don't know who actually gave the artifact. You see, I speculate that this might actually be a Daedric artifact, specifically one created by the Daedric prince Clavicus Vile. Remember, this is all speculation on my side, but I feel like an Aedric divine like Dibella, just disregarding the whole debate about the amount of power that the Divines still have, would not give an artifact like this just to some mortals and then leave it there in the room like that after the captives of Bravem actually escaped. This whole ordeal seems more like Clavicus Viles' MO. He is the Daedric Prince of Bargains and the embodiment of careful what you wish for. He enters pacts with mortals and grants them their wishes, but he's a trickster. And the wishes almost always come back to bite you if you're not very careful and precise in what you wish. This paintbrush inside the painted world has literally unlimited potential, it seems, but it's also a double-edged sword as we've seen, because remember, paint something dangerous like a troll and if you don't know what you're doing, you get straight up murdered by your own creation. Not just that, I can imagine the captives of Bravem Lythandas, after no answered prayers for their freedom from the Bella, just wishing that they were truly in the palace that they were imagining due to his illusions. So then Clavicus Vile appeared and fulfilled their wish, giving them the brush, not telling them that if they did not take the brush with them into the painted world, they would literally never again be able to leave. And of course, the brush was left outside, locking the captives forever inside that painted world of the palace. Of course, this is all speculation, but considering that this is an artifact which seems very nice on the surface, but can easily ruin your life, as remember, even Rythe himself, the guy that has the paintbrush in Oblivion, nearly got locked in his own painted world forever, just never to escape again. I mean, it feels far more like a Clavicus Vile-like thing to do. That would also explain why Rythe only makes paintings of nature and doesn't do any alive creatures or intelligent beings as far as we know, as perhaps the brush is even made in such a way that anything it paints which is alive would just attempt to kill the painter. I mean, I know trees are alive, but you know what I mean, like if you paint like animals or people, which would definitely be a Clavicus Vile thing to do, but considering that we only saw trolls being created, and trolls are just aggressive out of themselves, this is all just complete speculation, but hey, speculation is fun, and like I said, we have very little understanding of the painted worlds and true paint, and what their true nature is, so please let me know in the comments what you think. This is a very open speculation kind of subject and everything is possible. But I really feel like after examining all the information that we have, that this feels far more like one of the tricks of Clavicus Vile and doesn't really feel like the intervention of the Bella. But, you know, let me know what you think. Perhaps you think something completely different. I'll be really looking forward to what you guys write in the comments, because some of you guys are very creative. So let me know your theories in the comments, but that's about all I can say about Rythe Lythandas in the Painted Worlds. Now, next up, let's talk about a character who works in the background during the events of Oblivion, the man leading the Empire after the Emperor's assassination, High Chancellor Ocato of the Elder Council. So, High Chancellor Ocato, or Ocato of Firsthold, was a High Elf or Altmer politician serving as head of the Septim Empire's Elder Council during the years leading up to the Oblivion Crisis, and fungated as the Empire's interim ruler during the crisis after the assassination of Imperial Septim VII at the start of the game in Oblivion. Now, Ocato was born into a noble Altmer family, likely in the city of Firsthold, located in the Somerset Isles. From a young age, he seems to have received an elite education in magic, eventually becoming a highly skilled and powerful battle mage. In the following years, most likely when he became an adult, somewhere before the year 389 of the Third Era, Ocato had become a representative on the Elder Council of the Septim Empire, its sort of parliament. It's presumed that he represented either the Somerset Isles or represented his home city of Firsthold, although the exact structure of representation within the Elder Council has never really been clear and has changed throughout the years, so what exactly his role was before becoming High Chancellor, we don't really know. Now, after the defeat of Jaegar Tharn, the former battle mage of Emperor Uriel Septim VII, who had actually impersonated Emperor Uriel Septim VII for nearly a decade during the event of the Elder Scrolls Arena, when the Emperor himself was locked away in a pocket plane of Oblivion while Jaegar Tharn, disguised as the Emperor, ruled the Empire underwent a major political purge of sorts after he was ousted. Many high-ranking nobles who had collaborated with Tharn or turned a blind eye in exchange for personal gain were likely removed, and new loyal faces entered the Empire's elite circles. It was during this time that Ocato gained the Emperor's trust, replacing Jaegar Tharn as the Emperor's personal battle mage, and after a while his loyalty and service on the Elder Council solidified his position as one of Uriel Septim VII's most trusted advisors and closest friends. Now, eventually this trust and partnership led Ocato to ascend to the role of High Chancellor, essentially the head and chairman of the Elder Council and the second most powerful person in the Septim Empire. He and Emperor Uriel formed a quite amazing team, often crafting major policy decisions together, and it was them who also together came up with the secret mission to Daggerfall, which kicked off the events of the Elder Scrolls 2 and culminated in the Miracle of Peace in High Rock. Now, it's also believed that Ocato played a role in advising Uriel VII to send the Nerevarine to Morrowind, as a decision which then led to the eventual defeat of Dagoth in the Elder Scrolls 3 Morrowind. During his time as Chancellor, Ocato's loyalty never seems to have wavered. After the assassination of Uriel Septim VII and the extinction of the Septim bloodline at the start of the Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion, Ocato never attempted to seize power, and instead he supported the claim of Martin Septim, the Emperor's bastard son, when he came forward. And during the crisis he worked tirelessly to keep the Empire stable during the emerging Oblivion crisis. He coordinated the efforts with the Elder Council and becoming the de facto leader and regent of the Empire during the chaos. And it's in that role that we meet him in the game. Now, while he was applauded by many for holding the Empire together during the crisis, he wasn't without his critics. Some nobles accused him of trying to grab power, for example, while others claimed that he favored either the provinces or the heartland of Cyrodiil too much, depending on who you ask. For example, those in Morrowind claimed that Ocato pulled troops to Cyrodiil to relieve it, leaving Morrowind to die basically, while those in Cyrodiil during the crisis claimed that Ocato refused to pull troops from the provinces in order to keep the Empire together, thus letting Cyrodiil bleed. But to be honest, these different criticisms likely just reflect the impossible position of leadership during a crisis rather than any clear wrongdoing, as Ocato truly seems to have led the Empire as faithfully as he could and combated the Oblivion crisis as best he could. Now, during the climax of the Oblivion crisis, Ocato personally received Martin Septim in the Imperial city during the main questline. Tragically though, this was too late, as Mehrunes Dagon himself invaded Nirn in a final-ditch effort to complete the destruction of the mortal plane. To stop this, Martin then of course sacrificed himself, becoming the avatar of Alectus to banish Dagon and seal the barrier between Nirn and Oblivion forever, and in doing so, he also shattered the Amulet of Kings, and he ended the need for a Dragonborn Emperor to maintain the barrier. Once again at this point, Ocato refused to seize power, even when there was no Septim heir left and people begged him to take power to keep the Empire stable, as many, including Ocato himself, probably noticed that if there's no need for a Dragonborn ruler, anyone could take power, so that was an invitation to chaos. But Ocato instead attempted to find a new emperor to unify the Empire, thinking that he himself was not the unifying figure that the Empire needed probably. But the Elder Council could not agree on a successor. Only after repeated requests from the Council itself, Ocato accepted the title of Potentate, as he was the only one who they could agree on. And as a title of Potentate, he was a temporary ruler and not even an emperor. Just a temporary ruler to provide stability and lead the reconstruction efforts in the wake of the Oblivion crisis, with the intention to then get a new emperor when things settled down a bit. It seems that he relented finally because the Empire was landing in a second crisis in these months, and Ocato probably anticipated even further troubles that you would need a strong leader to solve. As he was aware that the provinces were already restless before the Oblivion crisis, and despite his efforts in these years to hold the Empire together, the Empire slowly started sliding back into a crisis, because only 4 years after Ocato's potentate reign started, in a period when he was seemingly doing a pretty good job in stabilizing the situation, the Empire began to rapidly collapse, as Morrowind suffered the cataclysmic Red Year with the eruption of the Red Mountain, which destroyed most of Morrowind, and that was then followed by the Argonians invading Morrowind barely 2 years later during the Accession War, seemingly as a revenge for centuries of slavery. And this invasion also led to Black Marsh's official secession from the Empire. And other provinces in the meantime also began to fracture, and regional wars erupted across northwestern Tamriel apparently. And as if this weren't enough, Ocato himself was assassinated in the year 15 of the 4th era. Who exactly took him out was never officially confirmed, but suspicion falls heavily on the Thalmor, because you see, Ocato as a high elf understood the dangers of rising extremism within his homeland of the Somerset Isles, and during his time as potentate, the Thalmor had gained more and more power and public favor in the Somerset Isles, by claiming credit for ending the Oblivion crisis and claiming that it was them and not Martin Septim who ended the crisis, which led to a lot of popularity and a lot of anti-imperial sentiments in the Somerset Isles. Ocato viewed their rise with grave concern and allegedly began taking steps to oppose them, but before he could truly act, he was killed, likely by Thalmor agents. His death then marked the beginning of the so-called Stormcrown Interregnum, which is a chaotic 7-year period where petty rulers vied for control over the Ruby Throne, and then the Empire fragmented even further. Eventually, order would be restored under Titus Mede, who seized power and began reuniting the Empire eventually, but that's a story for another time and another video. That being said, I still think that Ocato is a bit of a tragic figure. He seemingly truly tried to do the best he could to keep the Empire together and rule it as fairly as possible, but the tide and times just simply seems to have been against him, which is pretty sad. And you could also make a case for if he had just, grabbed power a little bit earlier and hadn't wasted precious months trying to find a new emperor, but acted perhaps a bit more decisively after the Oblivion crisis, a lot of problems may have been lessened a bit. But hey, we'll never know, as this is simply how history ended up being. Alright, now having talked about High Chancellor Ocato, let's talk about yet another character that we see quite often during the game. The Grandmaster of the Blades, Grandmaster Jauffre. So, Grandmaster Jauffre, from the outside an unassuming monk, but secretly the Grandmaster of the Blades organization by the end of the 3rd era and beginning of the 4th era. As such, he was the one ultimately responsible for protecting the last Septim Emperors, and he was the head of the Empire's intelligence network at this time, as the Blades, who were loyal exclusively to the Dragonborn Emperors of Tamriel, fulfilled the role of the Empire's intelligence service as well during this time. Of Jauffre's early years we know precious little. All that we know is that as a Blade he was able to rise through the ranks rather quickly, as it seems that when Jauffre was most likely in his late 20s, early 30s, around the time that Jaeger Tharn, the antagonist of the Elder Scrolls 1 Arena, was defeated, and Emperor Uriel Septim VII was freed from his Oblivion prison, Jauffre was seemingly promoted to head of Uriel Septim VII's Palace Guard. It's quite likely that after Tharn's betrayal and his 10 years imprisonment at Tharn's hands, Uriel decided to wipe the slate clean, so to say, and fire a lot of those Blades who had served in high ranks during the 10 years that Tharn had been Shadow Emperor and he had been locked away in Oblivion. So it's most likely that at this time, 34 years before our playtime in the Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion, Jauffre was promoted to head of the Palace Guard. Probably replacing the previous office holder because, well, he didn't notice that his emperor had been locked up and replaced by Jaeger Tharn. Now it's in this role that the then Captain Jauffre had a lot of personal contact with Emperor Uriel Septim VII, and the two ended up forming a strong bond of trust and a friendship that would last until the time that both were old men. As one of Emperor Uriel Septim's closest confidants, Jauffre seems to have known about the Emperor's unhappy marriage to Empress Kala Voria, and as one of the Emperor's most trusted, he was the only one to be trusted with the knowledge of the Emperor's bastard son Martin's existence. In fact, it's Jauffre who tells us that during his time as captain of the Palace Guard, he was one night called into Emperor Uriel's private chambers, where the old Emperor handed Jauffre a sleeping baby boy in a basket. The Emperor then tasked Jauffre to bring the baby somewhere safe, where he could grow up as a happy child, somewhere far away from the palace. Jauffre says to us that the Emperor told him nothing more than that, but that he knew that it was the Emperor's son. Jauffre then took the child into the night and found a farm near Kavach, where he deemed that the inhabitants of the farm were worthy of giving Martin a happy childhood. He then put the basket with the child on their doorstep and disappeared into the night, making sure that neither the child nor his foster parents would ever learn the truth about his biological parents. Over the years, Emperor Uriel would ask Jauffre to check in on the boy every now and then, to see if he was still being treated right probably, and whether he was healthy and how he progressed as a person. Eventually, after years as the commander of the Emperor's bodyguard unit, Jauffre would be promoted from the captain of the Palace Guard to Grandmaster of the Blades, with Captain Ranald, who we see in the beginning of the Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion, taking over his role as captain of the Palace Guard. Jauffre served as Grandmaster of the Blades for a long time actively, but eventually he took steps back from leading the Blades day to day and started spending a lot of time in a new undercover identity as a monk in Wayne Priory, as a sort of pseudo-retirement, as he kept the title of Grandmaster, but only seemingly made decisions over big and important stuff in person at their headquarters, while the day-to-day operations of the organization were overseen by other commanders, which does not seem like a strange thing, as he says himself that many Blades, even high-ranking ones, are permanently undercover and don't serve the Emperor openly. Still, this seemed like a little pseudo-retirement, as when we find Jauffre in the game at Wayne Priory, he is already of quite an advanced age. Not as old as Emperor Uriel Septim, but definitely getting on in years. Anyway, we as the player find him at the opening days of the Oblivion crisis, as gates to Oblivion start opening all across Tamriel and Daedra start killing indiscriminately after the Emperor and all his heirs were assassinated, and the dragon fires in the Temple of the One were extinguished for the first time in hundreds of years, as there was no legitimate Septim heir to relight them and protect Nirn from Oblivion. Jauffre was probably in mourning over the death of his old friend, but he immediately returned to active duty as open leader of the Blades when we bring him the Amulet of Kings, the King's Jewel of the Empire needed to relight the dragon fires by a legitimate dragonborn emperor. At this point, Jauffre is the only one who knows what needs to be done. With all the Emperor's sons dead, there's but one left who can relight the dragon fires, and he is the only one who knows of his existence. The bastard son, Martin Septim. So he and the player then plan to bring the Emperor's bastard son Martin to Cloud Ruler Temple, the Blades' base of operations where Martin will be relatively safe, so that they could protect the lost living Septim and perhaps save the Empire in the long run. So you as the player go and get Martin, while Jauffre presumably starts making plans and sends messages across Tamriel to the Blades for mobilization while keeping the Amulet of Kings safe. Unfortunately, this turned out not to be the brightest idea, as we, the player, probably should have kept the Amulet of Kings with us, since by the time we get back to Jauffre with Martin, Wayne Priory is under attack by the Mythic Dawn, the Daedra cult of Mehrunes Dagon, who started the entire crisis and are now the antagonists of the game. When we arrived, they were trying to take out Jauffre and steal the Amulet of Kings. Fortunately, they did not succeed in killing Jauffre, but unfortunately, they did succeed in stealing the Amulet of Kings. Now, despite this setback, Jauffre and the player bring Martin Septim back to Cloud Ruler Temple, and Jauffre had already sent the message ahead, and thus by the time of their arrival, the three receive a hero's welcome. Now, the player then officially gets accepted into the Blades, and Jauffre, Martin and the player then start to work against the Mythic Dawn in order to end the Oblivion crisis. And it's from that point on that Jauffre and the player's path mostly diverges, as Jauffre stays at Martin's side and the player goes out to do most of the field work. They conspire to take back the Amulet of Kings from the Mythic Dawn, so that with Martin's dragon blood and the amulet, Martin can reseal the barrier between Nirn and Oblivion by relighting the dragon fires. Meanwhile, in the story from that point on, he mostly takes a supporting role, while you and Martin do most of the heavy lifting. He will give you some tasks as your Grandmaster, and he goes where Martin goes, sworn to protect him from anything. As such, he takes part in the defense of Bruma, helps Martin open a portal to Mankar Cameron's Paradise Realm, and he is there to help escort Martin to the Imperial City at the story's climax, when Martin would be crowned Emperor, were it not for Mehrunes Dagon besieging the city himself. In fact, it was apparently Jauffre who sent the message ahead to the other council and contacted the head of the other council, Chancellor Ocato, about Martin's existence, facilitating a possible quick crowning ceremony. But alas, it was not to be, as in the end Martin, the last of the Septim dynasty, was forced to sacrifice himself to protect the mortal plane against the forces of Oblivion, as Mehrunes Dagon had sent an avatar of himself into the mortal plane, and the only way left to stop him would be for Martin to shatter the Amulet of Kings and become an avatar of Akatosh, beating Mehrunes Dagon back into Oblivion and sealing the barriers between Nirn and Oblivion forever, supposedly, although at the cost of the last living Septim that we know of. Now, Jauffre would later remark that Martin may be the greatest of the Septim Emperors for a sacrifice, and he would hold him dear forever. Now, what happened to Jauffre himself after the Oblivion crisis is unknown, but we do know that about 40 years later, during the Elder Scrolls novels, he seemingly no longer leads them. For his sake, I hope that he died rather quickly and peacefully within like 5 years of the story of Oblivion, as after about 5 years shit starts hitting the fan again on Tamriel, but ultimately we don't even know anything. It's possible that he somehow still lives by the time of the novels and just stepped down as Grandmaster into a, real retirement, but we simply don't know, and it would simply just be speculation at that point. Anyway, that's about all I can say about Grandmaster Jauffre, and with his story behind us, let's talk about one of my favorite stories of all stories in Oblivion. The story of Amantius Alectus and his experiments to make flowers vampiric. It's a very easy to miss story. That's actually pretty creepy. So, in the year 433 of the Third Era, the year of the Oblivion crisis and the time in which the Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion takes place, a man named Amantius Alectus lived in the Imperial City. We can meet him in Oblivion, and for all terms and purposes, he seemed like a respectable man, a writer by trade. But if we dig a little deeper during the Thieves Guild quest May the Best Thief Win, you can find out that he actually has a much darker side to him. In his house we can find his diary, together with a table filled with flowers which is surrounded by blood. In my first 2 playthroughs of the game, I have to admit I never really read the diary, but A while back I read it for the first time and I found out what the deal was with this creepy setup in his basement. You see, if you read the diary, you can find out that Amantius Alectus was trying to create undead plants infused with vampirism. In order to create his vampiric plants, which he would call drinkers, he created a special type of seed, a drinker seed. From his diary we learn that if you mix a plant seed with 2 parts of grave dust, 1 part of ash salts, and then mix those 3 ingredients with human blood, and then expose the drenched seed to 2 hours of moonlight, you get vampiric plant seeds. From the moment that he planted the seeds, he had to apply a very specific and precise schedule of nutrient solutions that he applied to the plants. Part of that solution was the blood of rats. After a while, the first shoots of the drinker plants appeared, and after which he was able to also start seeing fronds of the plants, and the plants slowly grew larger as he kept feeding them blood. After a while, he started noticing that despite there being no wind in his basement, the vampiric plants waved about as if they were standing in a breeze. At this time he also ran out of rat blood and he started kidnapping local cats and dogs, which he needed for the blood that he had to feed to his vampire drinker plants. But at some point he got cut by one of his plants, after which he noticed that the drinkers refused to feed on the blood of animals anymore, and from that point on only seemed to want to feed on human and elven blood when he offered them some of it. Because at one point he had offered them some of his own blood and they drank that greedily, while the ones that he fed animal blood started to wither. He then secretly started buying human blood from the healers in the Imperial city, whom he had paid a lot of hush money to keep quiet so he could continue his experiment. But it wasn't long until the plants wanted so much blood that he started to doubt himself and doubted whether or not he had created something evil, as up until that point he believed that he was doing something good, something for the good of all the Empire. But perhaps the price was too high at that point and the plants were just evil. After some more deliberation, he then burned all of his notes on how to create the plants and set the trays of the plants on the roof of his house where the sunlight could touch them. After an hour of exposure to sunlight, the plants were dead and were withered. His experiment had been too dangerous and he decided to stop it before it was too late. But here's the thing though, what exactly was the purpose of his experiment? Amantius Alectus states in his diary that he believed that he was doing something for the good of all of Cyrodiil. But how exactly? Because, you know, vampiric plants, what's good about that? Well, I've got a few theories for you. You see, I got the idea for this video when I saw a UESP tweet a couple of days ago, which reminded me of this quest. And in the comments of this tweet, there was the very discussion taking place on what the exact purpose of this experiment was. So credit where credit is due for the following 2 theories. First, we have the theory of the UESP Twitter admin, who suspects that Amantius wanted to plant these vampiric plants in the caves and abandoned ruins of Cyrodiil in order to prevent bandits and monsters from settling in the caves. It's an interesting theory, because you plant the plants in the cave, and because it's dark there, they can grow there, and they can sort of protect the caves against intruders like bandits and monsters, but they can't spread out of the cave, since once they set foot out of a cave or grow their offspring out of a cave, then they will die because of the sunlight. But it's an interesting theory, but in Amantius' notes we can read that the plants wither if they don't feed on blood for a long time. So I'm personally not that inclined to believe the theory, since the plants would die out at some point and then, you know, bandits can still just enter. But on the other hand, perhaps that was Amantius' goal and he just hadn't found a way yet to make them sustainable without too much blood. And that may have been the end goal, but I guess we'll never know. Now, a second interesting theory I saw on Twitter was by a user named Prime Directive. His theory was that Amantius maybe wanted to create a consumable crops which needed blood instead of water and sunlight, so that farms could more easily be cultivated in less accessible places, such as caves or maybe during very harsh winters. It's an interesting theory, and it's close to my own theory, because I personally think that he may have wanted to try and find a way to make immortal plants which could be harvested for crops for years and years and years without the plant dying. But then again, Amantius' research was too short to actually find out whether the fruits of his drinker plants would be edible or not for mortals, or whether undead plants would even be able to carry fruits or not, because the experiment was quite short in his lifetime, but perhaps that was the goal. Anyway, what the exact goal of the experiment is, we don't know. These are all theories, and please let me know your own theories down below. because I'm actually very interested to learn what other people think about this experiment. Some people online have suggested that Amantius may just have been off his rocker and he just didn't make any sense in his thoughts, but then even he must have had some goal in mind which was for the good of all of Cyrodiil, so I wonder what he might have thought and what the exact good in his head was for these plans. But yeah. What's interesting about this whole ordeal is that apparently vampirism can spread to all living things, not just elves and humans. We already kind of knew this because of death hounds that we can see in Dawnguard, and the fact that Argonians, who share no blood or genes with elves or humans, can also become vampires. But to know that even plants can become vampiric is really, really interesting. Imagine if, for example, a whole jungle like the ones in Elsewhere or Valen would got infected. Quite interesting to think about, but since the vampiric plants seem to die in the sunlight, it's not really a realistic scenario which would ever come through, I think, but still interesting to think about. Because if all living things could be infected with vampirism, we can also see, for example, I don't know, vampiric ladybugs or vampire fish, or even vampiric cliff racers, which is a thought probably too terrifying for mortals. Anyway, that's about all I can say about the vampire flowers and Amantius Alectus. Next up, let's talk about another personal favorite character of mine, the Count of Skingrad, Count Janus Hassildor, a count with a big secret. So, as most people know, every county in Cyrodiil is ruled by either a count or countess. They are an important part of the Cyrodiilic government and serve an important role in ruling the province, keeping order and boosting morale for the people in hard times. The counts in different counties of Cyrodiil enjoy various levels of popularity among their people, with some having a quite high approval rating and some having a lower approval rating. But there is one count who, despite never actually appearing in public and almost never meeting with any of his subjects, still enjoys a great popularity with his people, the Count of Skingrad, Count Janus Hassildor. He is rarely seen in public, with almost none of his citizens ever having seen him in real life, as anyone who has business with the Count will generally have to meet with one of his aides or advisors rather than with the Count himself. The excuse for this given by the Skingrad government is that the Count is a shy and reclusive person. And while some may doubt this official explanation, most of his subjects in County Skingrad have forgiven him this eccentricity, as he is generally loved by most of his subjects for keeping Skingrad prosperous and peaceful over the course of his long reign, as their lives are good and Skingrad is rich. Of course, there are some out there who question the Count's shyness and who think that there's something more going on, but most people generally don't care and just shrug it off as long as the Count does his job correctly. But, as you may have guessed since I just literally spoiled it in the intro, those who ask questions are correct. Because the reason the Count is so very rarely seen in public, and while when he's seen that's only in darkness, is because he's a vampire. You see, around 50 or 55 years before the Oblivion crisis, Count Janus Hassildor and his wife Rona Hassildor were infected with vampirism, leading them to eventually becoming full-fledged vampires. This was all by accounts a disaster for them, as by this time Count Janus Hassildor was already a count, and he was already quite beloved by the people, and if the public would ever find out about his vampirism, that could end his tenure and possibly ruin his life and negate his accomplishments in the eyes of the public. So, in short, he and his wife's entire lives would be ruined. So he decided to keep his affliction, vampirism, a secret and only tell his very trusted and close confidants of this situation, asking them to become his mouthpiece while he would continue to rule Skingrad. The only ones who officially knew that the Count and his wife were vampires were those in the castle that he trusted, and presumably also the Emperor, as the Emperor would often meet face to face with the Counts of the province, and as such I presume that he knew of Hassildor's situation, although we don't have any confirmation for that, unfortunately. Anyway, he and his wife would live most of their lives in the back rooms of the castle, where none except for the most trusted servants were allowed to come, while in the meantime he was looking for a cure to their vampirism, as Janus and his wife realized that the Count is crowd shy excuse would only carry them so far. However, despite looking desperately for a cure, they never found one, and so Janus Hassildor was forced to accept that his life would simply drastically change forever, and that if he would continue to rule Skingrad, it would be from the shadows. He then decided to embrace the immortality and powers that came with vampirism, starting to present himself as a powerful, reclusive mage, so that the people of the county would presume that he used complex life-extending magic to live for such a long time, instead of vampirism. He also arranged that he was able to drink blood without having to attack people. We don't exactly know how this worked, but it's likely that this blood was either taken from criminals or blood voluntarily given by his close servants, as it said that he drank blood only when he absolutely had no other choice and had to drink it to simply prevent bad side effects, but other than that, he would never drink blood. It was all one big perfect arrangement, except that his wife Rona, whom he loved very much, could not accept their situation, and she hated what she'd become. She refused to drink the blood required to sustain her, which eventually led to her falling into a deep coma, a sort of limbo between life and death for a vampire from which she could not escape. And while the Count's trusted servants did their best to keep her sustained, she simply did not want this existence and thus remained in the coma. But she also did not want to die as a vampire, because that would likely mean that her soul would disappear in the realm of Molag Bal, not something that the average person would want. So, for her sake, Count Hassildor kept searching for a cure to the vampirism, if only so that he could cure his wife before death, so that her soul could find peace. But there was only so much that he could do, as he could not venture out of the city for long periods of time to search for a cure, as that would draw the wrong kind of attention. And as such, he actually became quite lonely without his wife to keep him company while governing Skingrad as best he could. Now, while some, of course, developed suspicions, most people seem to have believed the story of the life-extending spells, and those who did not and suspected the Count of being a vampire quickly stopped caring, as during his reign Count Hassildor demonstrated that his heart was in the right place despite his affliction, because he kept necromancers and other vampires firmly out of the city, because while other vampires assumed that with a vampiric Count they might have easy pickings in Skingrad and that the Count would allow them to feed on the population, Count Hassildor saw other vampires as dirty animals who gave into their primal instincts and should be ashamed, and thus kept them out of his city. Meanwhile, he also did what he could to keep vampire hunters at arm's length, as he often had them dealt with clandestinely, either by luring them away from the city peacefully, or having them dealt with in other unofficial ways, trying to make sure that he was never linked to the efforts to get rid of the hunters, in order for him not to fall under suspicion of being a vampire, of course, or hating vampire hunters, as that would lead people towards the wrong kind of conclusions. We as the player can actually help him with this, as we can help him get rid of some vampires who try to enter his city, but we can also help him then by keeping some hunters out of the city so that they don't figure out his secret. The man really just wants to be left alone and trying to do the best that he can for his people, and I can respect that. Now, in the game, Janus Hassildor plays a pretty important role for any player trying to cure themselves of vampirism, as in order to find a cure, you can help him finish his research into a cure for vampirism, so that he can cure his wife, and that you can cure yourself. In the quest you can go out into the world to finish his research and then bring the cure back to him. We then get to see a quite touching scene where his wife is woken from the coma and given the cure for vampirism. Unfortunately, she was so weak that after almost 50 years in a coma, she did not survive the cure, but her soul was then able to find peace, something which the then grieving Count is happy for. Now, while we don't know what became of Count Hassildor after the events of the Elder Scrolls IV Oblivion, as we literally know nothing of his whereabouts after the game, I do have some speculations, but keep in mind these are based on nothing except for what I think based on his character and what I'd like to see. Because if I had to guess, and again this is just speculation based on nothing, I think that he kept ruling the city until perhaps the Stormcrown Interregnum, that period of time when the Empire completely fractured and fell apart after the death of its last interim ruler, Potentate Ocato. Video on that whole business in the description. Now, I think that in the Stormcrown Interregnum he likely did everything he could to keep Skingrad out of the chaos and keep the city prosperous and safe while the rest of the country descended into chaos. And I think, again, this is all speculation, that when order returned to the land and a new Imperial dynasty unified the Empire again, the Mede dynasty, he may have cured himself of vampirism eventually and passed the torch to another Count, and eventually probably joined his wife, who we very much missed, in the afterlife. But that's just all speculation based on nothing. It's also possible that he is still Count by the time of Skyrim, or perhaps he lives a secluded life somewhere away from the public after stepping away. We simply don't know. Alright, having talked about Count Hassildor, let's talk about another character. Now, this character does not directly appear during the events of Oblivion, but he is someone who's very likely alive during the events of the game, and who is actually a pretty big celebrity around Tamriel that you can read about in Oblivion's lore books, and who lives down south and elsewhere during the events of the game. Cherim the Tapestry Maker. So, Cherim. Cherim was a Khajiit living in the city of Orcrest in Elsewhere around the end of the Third Era. We don't know whether he was still alive during the events of Morrowind and Oblivion, but we can assume that he still was, as he was a young soldier during the 5-year war between Valenwood and Elsewhere, where he fought in several battles, which was around 30 to 40 years before the events of Oblivion and Morrowind. So, needless to say, the tapestries that I show in this video, which are from the Elder Scrolls Online, are from the Second Era and are thus not Cherim's work, but I need some background footage. Just like if you see any Khajiit in this video, it's not him, as we don't know what he looked like. But it's just an example. That said, Cherim got his fame after that war, the 5-year war. Presumably when the war was over, he settled down in the city of Orcrest, where he started to design elaborate tapestries with artwork on them. In this early period of his work, Cherim worked on tapestries depicting contemporary history. It said that one of his first tapestries was a tapestry depicting the Battle of the Heart of Anaquina, the turning point in the 5-year war, where the Khajiit, according to Cherim, got the upper hand in the war. He himself had taken part in that battle, and on the tapestry he had depicted the armies taking part in the battle, even embroidering a picture of himself in the tapestry where he was looting the corpse of one of his Bosmer enemies. That tapestry, the Heart of Anaquina, was one of his first tapestries, which launched him into fame and where people recognized his talent with craft. His speciality, according to the lore that we have, was his color use, which was said to consist of muted background colors and luminous colors used for the skin tones of characters on the tapestries. It seems that his talent was so great and his tapestries he made were so beautiful that he quickly became very famous all around Tamriel, with his tapestries selling for higher and higher prices as time progressed. And it seems that someday there came a point where he himself was unable to keep up with the demand for his work, and so he opened several weaving factories in different places around Elsewhere to help make replicas of his work to be sold all around the Empire. This was arguably a good decision, so as from what we hear he became very rich of this business, with replica tapestries selling very well across the continent. But the fact that there were readily available replicas did not stop the demand for tapestries being made by the artist himself. Those made by the hands of Cherim himself sold for exorbitant amounts, with the Imperial government owning several, and 10 of them, several years before the events of Oblivion, reportedly being in the Emperor Uriel Septim VII's hands, with negotiations going on to obtain 5 additional ones from the artist himself for the Emperor's collection. Cherim had at this point truly become a Tamrielic celebrity, with his name famous all across the Empire, and at the time of his life he was probably at this point the most famous Khajiit around the continent. At the very apex of his fame, Cherim had changed his work from depicting contemporary events like battles of recent wars to important historical and metaphysical events. We know of works of his depicting the creation of the world by the gods, the exodus of the prophet Valen and his followers from the Somerset Isles, which led eventually to the Dark Elf Society. He also made a tapestry of the Aelids fighting the legendary Moriahas at the White Gold Tower. And according to one out-of-game source, he made a tapestry, currently in possession of the Imperial government, which depicts a moth priest on top of the White Gold Tower as a dragon circles the tower, with some in the community speculating that this may depict a metaphysical scene taking place during the Middle Dawn or the beginning of it, with the Middle Dawn being the longest known dragon break in Tamriel's history. But that's just speculation based on an out-of-game unlicensed text by ex-Elder Scrolls Online writer Douglas Goodall, so take that with a grain of salt, as it is out-of-game. But that same text states, however, that Cherim's tapestries evoked a sense of significant form, a real-world aesthetic theory which states that for something to be art, it needs to evoke emotion in its viewer, and even if it's not necessarily beautiful in a conventional way. This could make sense and provide an explanation as to why the people of Tamriel were so drawn to Cherim's work, but again, this came from an unlicensed text, so it may be contradicted at some point, but still, I like the explanation for his fame, and I like the explanation that that's why his tapestries were so beautiful and were so coveted around Tamriel. With that being said, that's basically all that we know about the famous tapestry artist, Cherim. Quite an interesting character, and I really wish we could see one of his actual tapestries. This fresco depicting some concept art of Valen and his exiles may be one of his tapestries, but considering he was famous for color use, I don't really think it is, since it has, I don't know, it's very faded and it's, you know, called a fresco in the concept art, so I don't really think it's a tapestry, but it might resemble some of his tapestries. On the other hand, I think that considering his legendary status, we'd best never really see one of his tapestries, so they can continue to speak to our imagination. considering their mythical status. I think that whatever texture either Bethesda or one of their other studios comes up with for a Tapestry could be underwhelming, maybe. Anyway, that doesn't really stop my curiosity to see them. But that's about all I can say about Cherim. Now, for the final character of this video, I'd like to talk about Valen Dreth, Oblivion's mean prisoner that you see during the start of the game and who insults you. With the original lore video that this script originates from, I'm pretty sure that I got the record of the very first Oblivion Remastered lore video to release after the release of the game, as it was posted barely 3 hours after the game launched, which is a cool record to have. Anyway, let's talk about Valen Dreth now. So, Valen Dreth. Like I said in the intro, he is the very first person that you'll ever see in your Oblivion playthrough. After creating your character, you will see him in the cell across from you, seemingly the only other prisoner in the block. And no matter who or what you are, he will taunt you, be incredibly mean to you and predict your future death. I mean, to several of the races, including Argonians and Khajiit, he'll make quite racist comments, and if you are a Dark Elf, so the same race as the man himself, he will either tell you that he'll steal your wife once he gets to Morrowind if you're male, or if you're female, he will make comments how he wants to get in your cell to sleep with you. This guy is just a piece of crap. But as such, he has also become one of Oblivion's most recognizable and most iconic characters. And when I was preparing for the launch of Oblivion Remastered, I was wondering whether there was more to this guy than meets the eye, and whether or not there is a reason why he became such an incredibly hateful person. And, well, if we delve into the little bit of backstory that we have on him, we actually get quite a tragic picture. By piecing together several of his and other NPCs' dialogues, we find out that as a prisoner he got shipped all the way from Morrowind to serve his sentence in the Imperial City's prisons, likely having committed a severe crime against the Imperial government in Morrowind, otherwise he'd likely have been imprisoned there. As a fun side note, by the way, as such, he's actually the polar opposite of the Nerevarine, the player character from the Elder Scrolls 3 Morrowind, who actually came from the Imperial City prisons and was shipped out to Morrowind to fulfill their destiny of stopping Dago'Dur. As an even funnier side note, the Nerevarine was sent to Morrowind in the year 427 of the Third Era from the Imperial City prisons to Morrowind, so 6 years before the events of Oblivion, while we know that Valen Dreth was imprisoned in the Imperial City prison 11 years before the start of Oblivion. So he may actually have known the Nerevarine and Saint Jib, who were in the Imperial City prison during his time, which is actually quite a funny coincidence, but I digress. We know actually very little about Valen Dreth's life before being sent to Cyrodiil. In fact, all that we know is that he came from Morrowind, very likely from Vvardenfell, and that there he was married before being shipped off, as we know that he had children who carried his last name. In fact, we can meet one of his descendants in Skyrim, Romlin Dreth, who works at the Blackbriar Meadery. Romlin actually gives us one of the very few leads as to why Valen was imprisoned, as he claims that Valen Dreth was imprisoned after killing some Imperial guards before being shipped off to Cyrodiil and thrown into the Imperial City dungeons. Although, Romlin Dreth is not the most reliable narrator, as according to other characters, Romlin actually makes up stories about his ancestor, also apparently saying that Valen Dreth tried defending the Emperor against the Mythic Dawn, which is just factually wrong if you've ever played Oblivion's tutorial. But having murdered Imperial guards in Morrowind is very much the kind of crime that could see you being shipped from Morrowind all the way to Cyrodiil to serve your sentence, so it might be true. Now, that being said, his life in prison was quite literally miserable. Over the 11 years in prison, he apparently got almost no outside time, always being locked in his lonely cell in a block of the prison where almost no other prisoners were kept. In the very few times that he was allowed to roam the yard of the prison and get out to get some fresh air, he could still not see the outside world, despite being able to hear the ship bells of the ships on Lake Rumer and being able to hear the seagulls. His life was just incredibly lonely, only having a few guards who mistreated him to keep him company, along with the many rats that infested this part of the prison and sometimes even entered his cell. We know that over the course of his 11-year imprisonment, he was purposely kept underfed, with starvation being used as a torture method, alongside actual torture, because we know that over his time in the prison, the guards who were bored of guarding such an empty part of the prison actually used him for entertainment, verbally abusing and physically beating him for fun while he cried and screamed for help until deep into the night. And this seems to have been the case for his full 11 years of imprisonment, as a guard can literally be heard saying that he will really miss their sessions as the end of Valen's sentence quickly approaches at the beginning of Oblivion. He really hates the prison. He's always hungry and gets severely mistreated. And while this mistreatment is seemingly a thing for all the prisoners in the Imperial City prisons, to some extent at least, he really seems to have gotten the worst of it in combination with a very long prison sentence. Over those 11 years, his body has become frail and starved. He's a shadow of his former self. He's a wreck, physically and likely mentally as well. Now, by the time of Oblivion, his 11-year prison sentence is almost up, and he's planning to go back to Morrowind after his sentence, mocking the guards that he will finally leave, while they have to stay there. But Valen will never leave. He will never leave the prison, as when you join the Dark Brotherhood in the game, it's revealed that someone performed the Black Sacrament and chose Valen Dreth as your new target for assassination, so that he will never see the open air again. You don't really have a choice in carrying this out, and as such, while Valen begs you to let him out of his cell, he dies. Now, while we don't exactly know who ordered his assassination, we do have an idea, as the clues all actually point towards the guard captain of the Imperial City prison. You see, there are several clues pointing towards him, or perhaps one of the other guards being the one to order the assassination. First of all, in the captain's office you can literally find several of the ingredients for the Black Sacrament ritual. Second, the contract to kill Valen Dreth literally gives you a bonus for not killing any of the guards, which realistically nobody other than a guard or Imperial official would demand. And third, from the dialogue of the characters in the prison, we can actually learn that they have all come to hate Valen Dreth for his foul mouth and insults. But let's be honest, I would also hate people if they abused me for 11 years, so maybe it's a bit their own fault. But yeah, we aren't completely sure who ordered his kill, but it was likely one of the guards. Now, I have to say that knowing his backstory, I wouldn't say that Valen Dreth is fully redeemed or anything. I mean, he remains a hateful bastard, but perhaps I've gotten a bit more understanding as to why he's so hateful. Perhaps mocking and insulting others is just a bit of a coping mechanism that has formed in him after the years of torture and pain. And while being hateful is not right, I think the guards have done far worse things to him. So, redeemed? No, because we also don't really know what he did to get in there. But do I understand him better and feel slightly bad for him? Yes. Again, only slightly, because we don't really know what he did, or whether he was already such a bastard when being imprisoned there. In fact, other than the things that I've told you, we don't really know anything about him at all. But I do hope that I've given you a bit more of an insight into an iconic character of Oblivion, and he was the final character in this long lore compilation. Now, I sincerely hope that you enjoyed this video, and that I managed to teach you something new about the Elder Scrolls lore today over the stories of these characters. And if you want to see the full backstory to some of the main characters of Oblivion, so Emperor Uriel Septim VII and Martin Septim, I actually put them in my video on the lore essentials for Oblivion Remastered. You know, things that you might want to watch in order to understand the full story of Oblivion Remastered. There's a story of Emperor Uriel Septim, there's a story of Martin, and I explain the full goals of the Mythic Dawn there, which is confusing to some people. Now, I highly doubt that many people watch all the way until the end of this video. So, you know what, if you watch all the way to the end, comment down in the comments what your favorite subject in high school was. I'm just genuinely curious, being a physics teacher in real life, besides this whole Elder Scrolls lore gig. I'm actually curious to see what people think. Now, please don't comment physics just because, you know, I'm a physics teacher, but tell me your honest answer. I'm curious. Anyway, I will see you all in the next regular lore video, probably very soon. See ya.